This presentation is going to be on crime in rural communities and how it affects the social and economic standings of those communities. So just a quick overview. Just like urban counterparts, rural areas in the United States are constantly fighting against crime and criminal activity. Rural areas do contain some of the same issues that urban areas do, but they also fight some of their own battles separately every day that maybe our urban counterparts might not experience as frequently. So in this presentation, we are going to take a look at the issues that rural areas face when it comes to crime, including the effects on social, political, and economic outlooks of the community, and how they face these crimes differently than urban areas. We will also take a look at the specific types of crime, the prevalence of crime, and even what people in these rural communities think about the crime and the issues that they face every day. This presentation, we are now going to talk about the types of crime in rural America. So rural America faces all kinds of crime and violence, just like urban areas in America. However, the way they experience them is very different. So rural areas experience crimes such as assault, theft, and burglary. And property crime and theft are among the highest types of crime that we will see in rural areas. We can kind of contribute the fact that there are more property crimes in rural America than in urban areas because there are less people and more property. And this is kind of just what you can see from the outside looking in. There are obviously more people in urban areas than we have in rural areas. So more victimizing crimes are not typically going to be seen as likely in rural areas as they are in urban areas. So the types of crime that occur in areas is highly dependent on the type of area it is. Since there are less people in rural areas, crimes against people directly tend to be lower. However, usually people in rural areas have more property and items, which makes for higher crime rates when it comes to property and theft. And along with the property, rural Americans tend to have farms, farm equipment, and just large-scale equipment and property all the way around. So a lot of those items are big ticket items and cost a lot of money, and those are the items you will see stolen on farms and in rural areas. So on the next slide, we are going to take a look at a graph of the statistics of the type of crime and how often they occur per 1,000 people in rural areas. So we will be able to get kind of a better picture on the more tendent crimes of rural America. On this slide, we are going to take a look at a graph of some compiled statistics over crime in rural USA. So what we're looking at here is on the left-hand side, you will see the type of crime. And then on the bottom, we can see that these blue bars represent crime rate per 1,000 people in rural areas. So we can right off the bat see how we previously talked about property crime, theft, and burglary being on the top of the list for rural America. We can already see that that is true, and we can see just how drastically that difference is between property crimes and, personable crimes. So violent crime is at an 18.3, which if you knock off the highest two is pretty comparable to the rest. Assault is at 11.8, robbery 5.9, sexual assault is actually only a 0.7. So that is a great statistic for rural America. Property crime is a whole 103.2. Now this is huge. This goes back to the previous slide when I was talking about how they are more likely to have things stolen from their farms. This, again, is in relation to the high dollar equipment that they have around, and the vulnerability that brings along with it for it to be stolen and for them to have crime brought against them. Theft is at 76%, again, with the property crime and the equipment being stolen, it all really ties together there. And burglary is at a 25.4. Vehicle theft is at a 1.8. So again, this is crime rate per 1,000 people. So we can go ahead and take a look at this and see right off the bat how rural USA is affected by crime. This slide is going to talk about the prevalence of crime in rural America. So the prevalence of crime in rural America has changed over the years, but it has seen a recent spike. Some experts believe this could be directly related to the pandemic and COVID-19. The prevalence of crime is tied to lots of factors. This could be a decrease in pay, losing jobs, minimal manpower and resources to fight crime, and lots of other things. So when we talk about a decrease in pay and losing jobs, this can be directly related to the officers that are losing their jobs and are unable to protect the rural areas, and also people just in the community losing their jobs and having a decrease in their pay, causing them to maybe resort to actually criminal activity and committing these crimes. So the amount of crime that takes place in rural settings has gone up, as the graph will show us. There will be a graph on the next slide, and we'll be able to kind of see the trend. And this is a battle that rural law offices fight every single day. So with the rates of crime going up and the manpower and resources diminishing, this is a huge problem, and this could potentially lead to an even higher statistic of crime in rural America in the following years. There's simply not enough manpower to enforce the rules and catch the criminals. The amount of people in the area of the crime is also lower in rural areas, meaning there are less chances of the crime being stopped while it is being committed or the criminal being identified. As they continue to get away with it, they continue to do it. So in urban areas, we can often see witnesses coming forward, and for our rural areas, this usually just simply is not the case. You will have the occasional farm with cameras or hired hands that are always around at all hours of the day and night. However, this usually, at least where we live, is not the case. So a lot of these smaller farms that are being attacked by crime, they're not able to get justice because there just simply is not enough evidence to pursue the criminal. And due to the costly amount of equipment and lots of resources found on most rural properties, this makes them a prime subject for attack, especially when people are fighting to survive a global pandemic. So some experts relate, the fact that farms have a lot of resources, whether that be food and livestock or like mechanical equipment, to the reasoning for them being attacked. These people are wanting those resources to survive and get by during this hard time, and they're having to resort to crime to get these resources. So we'll go ahead and take a look at the next slide and see how that trend has jumped. So this is the trend of the prevalence of crime in rural America and how we can see that it has changed. So it's going to be from 2015 all the way through 2020. This is the best range of data I was able to gather, and you can see on the left that the percentage of crime is going to be per 100,000 people, and then it's just kind of going to be a percentage all the way up the trending line. So we can see in 2015 it was at a 4.95, 2016 5.39, and then it kind of went to a decrease in 2017 and 2018. We had a very tiny bump up in 2019 to a 5.07. And then in 2020, we had a drastic jump by 1.5% almost to 6.52. Now, this is huge because this is the jump that the experts are relating to the global pandemic and COVID-19. So experts are saying that because of all of the precipitating factors and issues that came with the pandemic, people were resorting to crime to get by, and they were less afraid of being caught, some would even say, and they were able to get away with more during the pandemic. And this is again to limited resources, limited manpower, all the things we have previously talked about. So we can see how all of those factors have kind of played in to the jump in prevalence of crime in rural America. So on to the next slide, we're going to talk about the different perspectives that people have on rural crime. So this is going to be reports of crime from different rural perspectives. Interviews from different perspectives shed light onto the battles rural Americans face when dealing with crime. So I was able to speak with a local sheriff officer, and he talked on how rural law enforcement has been fighting battles to eliminate crime in unheard of circumstances. While they are expected to prevent and convict for the same crimes urban officers are, they are expected to do it with minimal resources. They have little to no extra funding, no extra resources or labs, and less employees. They also have more space to cover in their area. There is typically more ground per officer in the rural setting versus the urban setting. So he just kind of was able to shed some light on how they do things with way less resources than urban departments do things. They, number one, have less people on the force, less people to be out patrolling, less people to be, interviewing, less people to be doing the paperwork, all of the things. And they don't have as much funding either. So this kind of limits what they are able to do within their jurisdiction. The other issue that he really hit home on was the fact that they have a lot more space to cover, per officer. So this, it could be whether or not they are patrolling 5 country blocks, 10 country blocks, it doesn't matter. There's more space for a crime to occur. So when you have busy urban areas, there just isn't as much space, there's more people around, kind of what we talked about previously, versus in the country and in rural settings, there's vast space, very minimal people, and just a lot more room for criminals to execute criminal behavior and get away with it. I was also able to speak to a couple rural residents. So rural residents feel as though they were under attack when it came to facing the pandemic. They felt as if their livestock and equipment were vulnerable to being stolen. They worry that being so isolated from the rest of the urban population that this can make them more susceptible to experiencing crime. They also felt as though crimes that happen against their property do not have the same ability to be sought out and solved as those that are done against their urban counterparts. So again, some of the topics we talked about earlier, the pandemic really made a lot of people struggle to survive, and they were worried for their livestock and equipment being stolen as a means for these people to survive. And they also feel like crimes that happen against them and their property not being able to be solved in the same manner, has a lot to do with some of the other topics we talked about, how there's not enough people to be eyewitnesses, and there's not enough manpower on the force to always be patrolling a smaller area. All of the things that kind of make the perfect storm for more crime to be occurring in rural America. On this slide, we are going to discuss class variables on crime. So this is going to kind of highlight the difference between upper class and lower class rural America and how the crime is different between the two, and maybe in some ways how it is the same. So starting with the upper class, they are less likely to experience violent crimes, and they are more likely to commit fraudulent crimes against each other and lower class Americans. So versus attacking each other and, stealing or doing physical damage, they're more likely to be involved in monetary crimes, whether that be against themselves or against the lower class. They're also more likely to have plans in place to prevent crime from happening. So some of the wealthier, larger farms may have hired hands that are around the farm 24 hours a day, which is, manpower and surveillance there. And they also are more likely to have surveillance systems and things like that in place that may deter criminals from attempting to commit crime there. If we talk about the lower class, they are more likely to experience violent crimes, and they are less likely to be taken seriously based upon previous records. So some of the lower class rural Americans will have criminal backgrounds, and because of that, they may be less likely to turn to law enforcement for help based on those previous records. They're also more likely to experience a violent crime between each other. So the violent crime may not necessarily come from upper class to lower class or be upper class versus upper class. It's typically lower class versus lower classes where we see that violent crime occur. They're also more likely to have things stolen due to less proper storage to maintain rural equipment. So when we talk about having all this expensive and large equipment, a lot of your bigger farms and your wealthier farms are going to have locked storage facilities, barns, things of that nature, whereas your lower class is not going to have that. They may have things sitting out, they may have things in older barns that aren't able to lock, and that just makes them more susceptible to having their things taken. So this kind of gives us a look on how the social aspect of rural America can have an impact on crime, and not just crime itself, but also the type of crime that will occur and who it may occur to.
The economy and crime are very closely related. Rural communities have some of the highest poverty rates in America, and this not only leads to conflict between community members, but also allows businesses to take advantage of them. The world relies on rural communities for food and other raw supplies, as well as services like waste disposal and even holding many prisoners from urban areas. But even then, jobs are still very scarce, and many industries make the move as effective cost cutting, and don't actually consider how the communities will be affected. For an example, the National Criminal Justice Reference Service, or NCJRS, points to a study in Garden City, Kansas, of 2 meatpacking plants that brought in low-skill and low-paying jobs that actually lowered the per capita county income and also ended up bringing in many workers from across the country, which sprouted mobile home parks and led to more crime. Many waste management facilities and big farmers also contribute to one of the most prolific crimes in rural areas, which is illegal dumping. While illegal dumping happens in both urban and rural communities, it is a lot more common to get away with it in a rural area. Not only is this due to the vast land difference, but most people are on private wells which are not regulated and have to be checked personally for contamination. And even when it is caught, those who cause it often go either unpunished or severely underpunished. Many people living in rural areas are on the brink of or already living in poverty and don't really have a choice when it comes to the exploitative nature of companies around them. And poverty drives people towards crime, especially property crime, which is one of the most common in rural areas. On top of all of this, it's actually beneficial to keep people in prison in these areas because as long as they're full, they'll receive funding from the state. And while prisons do bring jobs, they once again pay very little and often bring a stigma to the community they're in, which typically pushes away potential better business. The economy and politics and rural crime are also related. Most politicians today solely focus on helping urban communities. This is because larger cities are more in favor of government and where most of the voter base resides. With that in mind, most laws are made and passed that only consider large cities, even if they don't apply everywhere. One example of this, given by the NCJRS, is that while it's commonly assumed that more gun ownership leads to more gun violence, that doesn't actually apply in most rural areas. Gun ownership is quite common in rural areas, and yet gun violence occurs less often than when compared to urban areas. This example shows that even large political debates like gun violence only really take into account urban conditions. Rural areas can often be a lot more variable in terms of culture and social conditions, as well as living conditions, but are often ignored by most politicians. Many people in bigger cities often ignore the struggles that people living in rural communities have, and often don't consider them in political discussion, despite around 1/4 of the U.S. population living in rural communities. This fact has left a lot of rural communities to resent the government as a whole, because not only is life sometimes harder for them, but they also don't have access to the services that most urban people do. Not only does the lack of support lead to more crime being committed, but it also leaves more people left to fend for themselves, because they have little to no faith that their problems can be handled by the government. The resentment of the government and the unfair treatment compared to urban communities has even led to local militias popping up in rural areas. While similar crime can happen in urban and rural areas, general theories about crime in urban areas are being applied to the entire country as a whole, and this leads to unfair policies and a lack of support for rural communities in America. There are many issues in rural communities that lead to crime being as rampant and unresolved as it is currently. One of the biggest issues for most communities is the lack of a proper police force. More often than not, there is a single sheriff and a few others designated to an entire county at times, and this obviously isn't acceptable. The response time is often a lot longer than in urban areas, and on top of this, there is a lot less patrol going on in general. The lack of a large police force is also bad due to the nature of rural communities. They are often very tight-knit and everybody knows each other, but where this can go wrong is that if somebody has a bad relationship with the sheriff, it could lead to problems. Which brings me to the next issue, which is that people in rural communities are usually unwilling to report crimes or hesitate from doing so. Many people in rural communities are reluctant to report crimes as they believe that the police can't do anything about it. There exist no forms of mass surveillance in rural communities compared to their urban counterparts, and since response time is so large, and people often can't afford tech for self-surveillance, many believe nothing can be done. Other reasons that crimes aren't reported are fear of retaliation from the offender being someone they know, or believing the crime itself isn't serious enough to report. A lot of people in rural communities also treat these crimes as personal matters and tend to want to deal with them on their own, especially if it involves someone they know. And sometimes it's hard to even discern if a crime has been committed. If a small number of livestock go missing, for instance, one might assume that they just wandered off before they were stolen, and if they were stolen, many believe authorities couldn't even help due to a lack of evidence, and so many small crimes like that go unreported. According to the USDA, poverty is the most common in rural areas, and poverty and theft are directly related. And as technology and equipment gets more and more expensive for farmers, the potential for theft and the reward for doing so become a lot greater. On top of theft, property damage and squatting are also very common in rural areas. Many farmers have building and land that go unused for certain parts of the year, and they often become shelter of the homeless, who can sometimes go unnoticed for months at a time. This also circles back to how people often have to rely on themselves more to try and stop crime in rural areas. The lack of police. There are many issues in rural communities. There are a few things that can be done by the government and by individuals to help minimize crime in rural communities. Rural communities as a whole are ignored politically. to change. To start, more resources need to be focused on policing in rural areas. Having a larger, more spread out police force will hopefully prevent crime and help restore some faith in the police. Better infrastructure assistance and benefits for people living in rural areas could help alleviate those suffering from poverty and may help in preventing crimes. As for companies that contribute to pollution and poor work conditions, harsher punishment needs to be given. For example, violating the Clean Water Act in states like North Carolina or Montana come with violations as low as $300 to $600. If it's cheaper to pay off a fine instead of fixing the problem, then the fine should probably be bigger. There is also very little unionizing in rural communities, and people standing up for better wages and safer work conditions could also alleviate poverty and help eliminate the need for any criminal activity. On top of making life in rural communities more bearable, the people living in these communities also need to put more effort into stopping crime themselves. Setting up more security on the property will help in catching more criminals. This could be an opportunity for the government to help supply security systems to those living in rural communities. Fences and lockable gates can be set up around the property to help prevent people from coming in. Signs can also be put up to help prevent accidental trespassing. Motion-activated lights and camera systems can be set up without Wi-Fi and can be used as evidence to help convict people, and even having trained dogs can help defend property. People also need to be willing to report crime when it happens. Even if people assume nothing can be done by the police, it's still better to report a crime and have little progress made on it than to not report it at all. The fact that so many crimes go unresolved directly leads to people thinking they can get away with more crime, and the combination of a bigger police force and community members who care to report crimes will ultimately result in more people being punished and ultimately diminishing the idea that rural crime is easier to get away with. There are a few things. The same types of crime happen in both urban and rural communities, but urban and rural communities are entirely different beasts. The culture, as a whole, can differ quite a lot between the two, and because of this, they function as two different environments and have different needs. Rural areas supply the rest of the world with most of the raw material goods that are needed, but are ignored the services offered outside of them. Poverty consumes many of those living in rural communities, and good-paying jobs or public services or benefits are often much harder, if impossible, to obtain. On top of this, while making up a large percentage of the population, rural communities tend to be ignored by politicians who are currently more focused on inner-city issues. This leads to a sense of mistrust of the government, as people living in rural communities are denied the resources and manpower that they need and are often completely ignored in today's world. Rural communities are subjected to the crimes of big industries which threaten not only to harm the environment, but continue to keep people poor. Support from the government in forms of a stronger police force and more financial assistance, as well as more strict and harsh punishment for industries that damage the environment and exploit workers, would go a long way in helping rural communities tackle crime, and could also help bring back trust in the government's ability to help. While the lack of resources and assistance is a large part of why rural communities deal with so much crime, the people living in these communities can also do more on their end to help try and alleviate crime. People putting more effort into trying to prevent crime on their property through the use of extra security and making sure to report crime are both options that individuals have to try and stop crime on their own. Government assistance and community engagement will both ultimately help in reducing the amount of crime in rural communities.